Genshin Impact is a wonderful game. With an ever-growing world and stylish art design, it's able to capture the imagination of players. Whether you enjoy the world, story, gameplay, one aspect that will keep players coming back are the amazing characters in the game. So, I'm Darcblade with a character guide to Kaeya in Genshin Impact. In this guide we will briefly cover the basic lore of the character, their moves and abilities, weapon options, stat priorities and artifact builds. Remember though that these guides are aimed for free to play and low spender players. So they will mostly feature characters as if they're at Constellation 0 with level 4 weaponry. Kaeya is a cryo sword user in Genshin Impact and one of the most versatile characters in the game. On top of that, he is also one of the very few free to play characters who I would rate quite highly, making him useful in pretty much any team. Kaeya is one of the first characters you will meet when playing through the story of Genshin Impact. He is the cavalry captain of the Knights of Favonius of Mondstadt. He is held in quite high regards as well. Through his charisma as well as his sword prowess, he's earned the respect of friends and colleagues alike. Kaeya also has a knack for spy work, creating an intelligence network to protect Mondstadt. This can make him quite secretive at times, but regardless he does his job well, despite his eccentricities. Even though Kaeya is loyal to Mondstadt, he is actually not from Mondstadt. His grandfather, a pirate, hails from a distant land, and as such, he was adopted into Diluc's family and raised alongside him, becoming brothers. Thanks to his adopted family, he grew through the ranks of the Knights of Favonius to become the cavalry captain and one of Mondstadt's most intelligent protectors. Now Kaeya is a free character. You unlock him by simply just playing through the story of Genshin Impact, but if you want to unlock more constellations, you have to do that through the gacha system. Now every character in Genshin Impact has various abilities referred to as talents, whether they're combat talents or passive talents. When it comes to Kaeya, his normal attacks are referred to as ceremonial blade work, in reference to his swordsmanship skills. When pressing the attack button, Kaeya can perform a 5-hit combo, to which the final hit will allow Kaeya to teleport behind an opponent and hit them from behind. Alternatively, you can hold down the attack button, which will perform a charged attack, knocking opponents away with a hard double slash. This though will consume a small amount of stamina to perform. And then finally for his normal attacks he has the plunging attack. This is performed mid-air by pressing the attack button, to which Kaeya will plunge his sword downwards into the ground, landing with an AoE attack that damages anyone around the impact point. The next combat talent is Frost Gnaw. This is your elemental skill. When unleashing your elemental skill, Kaeya will unleash a frigid blast directly ahead of him in a small arc. This will deal a decent amount of cryo damage to opponents struck by it. It's quite a simple cryo ability in all honesty. Frost Gnaw is a great way to set up elemental reactions with Kaeya, especially due to the fact that the elemental skill is on a very quick cooldown, being only 6 seconds. This means whether you're using Kaeya to either set up elemental reactions or set off elemental reactions, he can do the job incredibly quickly. Frost Gnaw is also a very good elemental skill for traversing the environment as well, as you can freeze lakes and open waters and cross them quite comfortably. On top of that, the cooldown should allow you to perform Frost Gnaw a second time, creating an ice bridge to where you want to go with Kaeya. Which brings us on to his next talent, which is another combat talent and his elemental burst known as Glacial Walls. When you activate Kaeya's burst, he will summon forth the frost in the air. This will form into 3 icicles that will revolve and gravitate around Kaeya. These icicles will follow the character, whether it's Kaeya or teammates around, dealing cryo damage to opponents in their path for the ability's duration. So it's a very useful elemental burst in all honesty. The main reason for why it's so useful is that it persists after Kaeya leaves the field. So after you activate Kaeya's burst, you can swap him out to another character to create various elemental reactions and more. On top of that, this ability is also on another quick cooldown and it lasts for a decent amount of time for an elemental burst as well, meaning that Kaeya can still contribute to a team's battle even if he's not the active character. Again, much like Frost Gnaw, as the icicles deal cryo damage, they can be used to set up and activate various elemental reactions, so pair really well with teams that utilize elemental reactions. But moving away from the combat talents to talk about the passive talents available to Kaeya. First of all is Cold-Blooded Strike. This is a simple survival passive for Kaeya. Every hit with Frost Gnaw, so your elemental skill, it will regenerate health for Kaeya equal to 15% of his attack. So it's a simple survival skill to help keep Kaeya alive. It's a shame it doesn't get past to allies, this only applies to him, but nonetheless, it's still a useful skill, especially because Frost Gnaw is on such a quick cooldown. Which brings us on to the next passive talent, which is Glacial Heart. Basically, opponents frozen by Frost Gnaw will drop additional elemental particles. However, Frost Gnaw may only produce a maximum of 2 additional elemental particles per use. So Glacial Heart is excellent when it comes to permafreeze teams. Basically teams that utilize Cryo and Hydro. Being able to freeze an opponent and having them completely frozen, and then utilizing Frost Gnaw again, will allow Kaeya to generate large amounts of elemental particles for himself and his team, allowing you to charge up your elemental bursts more quickly. And then finally for the passive talents is Hidden Strength. This is an exploration talent. Basically, it decreases sprint and stamina consumption for your own party members by 20%. This is not stackable with other similar buffs, but nonetheless, when you have Kaeya in your team and you're exploring the world of Genshin Impact, your stamina consumption for sprinting around will be reduced. So there we have it, those are all the combat and passive talents available to Kaeya. A very nice selection that utilizes and can fit in with many teams out there. But let's quickly talk about the constellations available to Kaeya. Now remember that these videos and the builds shown in these videos are really focusing on the character at Constellation 0, but if you are lucky enough to get Kaeya at higher constellations, there are 2 that really do stand out for me personally, which is Excellent Blood, your constellation level 1, which basically increases Kaeya's crit rate of normal and charged attacks by 15% against opponents who are affected by Cryo. So they don't even have to be frozen, they just have to have the Cryo debuff on them. This helps when it comes to using Kaeya as a main DPS or sub DPS character. And the other constellation, if you're able to get it, is constellation level 2, Never Ending Performance. Every time Glacial Waltz, so your elemental burst, defeats an opponent, its duration is increased by 2.5 seconds up to a maximum of 15 seconds. This, combined with a decent elemental recharge build, means that potentially Glacial Waltz could be active indefinitely during an encounter. But of course these videos are aimed at free-to-play and low-spender players, so you may not have access to the constellations. So let's move on to the next section, which is talking about the builds that I use for Kaeya. Now Kaeya is a mixed bag, he's a jack of all trades, so he could get away with using a lot of different builds. I'm going to be demonstrating 3 of them here. So first of all is the sub DPS build. This is how I mainly use him. This is a support DPS build that makes use of Kaeya's quick cooldowns on his elemental skill and elemental burst, as well as his elemental burst remaining on the field even when he is not. So when it comes to the weaponry for this sub DPS build, for the free to play options, I'd recommend either taking Iron Sting, which would mainly taken for the elemental mastery, which will help increase the damage of the elemental reactions that Kaeya can help with. Alternatively, if you're able to get it, Festering Desire would also be an excellent choice for this build, as not only does it have energy recharge, allowing us to get that elemental burst more quickly, but it also has the Undying Admiration, which increases the elemental skill damage by 32% as well as the elemental skill crit by 12%. If you've lucked out on the gacha system or you're a low spender, alternatives could be the Sacrificial Sword, which again has energy recharge and potentially allows us to cast Frost Gnaw twice in succession, or if you're looking for a freestyle weapon, Harbinger of Dawn is highly recommended for its crit damage increase as well as its crit rate increase, so long as you keep your health above 90%. So when it comes to the artifacts for this sub DPS build, I'd recommend going for 2-piece Noblesse Oblige set as well as 2-piece of the Blizzard's Drea set. 2 pieces of the Noblesse Oblige will give us an elemental burst damage increase of 20%, and 2 pieces of the Blizzard's Drea will also give us 15% increased cryo damage as well. As with this build, most of the time we will be switching Kaeya in to perform Frost Gnaw and his elemental burst more than anything else. Both these artifact sets benefit that playstyle. You can, if you wanted to, go for the 4-piece Noblesse Oblige, which will give the entire team an attack increase when you activate Kaeya's elemental burst, especially if you don't have someone already on the team with the 4-piece Noblesse Oblige. But nonetheless, I normally like to use Kaeya this way. As for the stats, when it comes to your sands, you'll want to focus on either attack percentage or energy recharge. When it comes to your goblet, you'll want to focus on cryo damage, and then when it comes to your circlet, you'll want to focus on crit rate or crit damage. When it comes to the substats on your artifacts, there are lots of options here in all honesty. Focusing on crit rate and crit damage is always a good choice. Attack percentage is also good, as it will increase the damage of Kaeya's various abilities. You can also go for energy recharge as well, and even elemental mastery could be potentially useful for this build if you're with a team that really relies on elemental reactions. But when it comes to the talents for this build, I'd recommend focusing on Glacial Waltz first, followed by Frost Gnaw, and then finally your normal attacks and the ceremonial blade work. Like I said, this is a very versatile build for Kaeya. He's still able to contribute to a battle, dealing a fair amount of damage while he's at it, and all this whilst not having to be on the field for that long. Also, should something happen to your main DPS, the sub DPS Kaeya build can also fill in the gaps while you either revive your main DPS or heal them, which for me is personally the preferred way I like to play Kaeya. But there are so many ways to play this character, which moves us on to the second build, which is the Permafrost DPS build. This build is all about Cryo and Hydro, so it is unfortunately reliant on the team composition that you use. But nonetheless, this allows Kaeya to become a Cryo main DPSer. So when it comes to the weaponry, you'll want to focus on a strong main DPS weapon, something like the Black Sword, if you purchase the Battle Pass, would do, which gives us increased crit rate, as well as increased damage to our normal and charged attacks, as well as a health regen. An alternative could be the Flute as well, which gives us a nice attack percentage increase, or failing that, the Amenoma, which is the craftable Inazuma sword, could also work. And of course, as always, if you don't have those options, then the Harbinger of Dawn, which we talked about in the first build, is also a great option. Which brings us on to the next part, which is talking about the artifacts. And for this build, you'll want the 4-piece Blizzard Strayer set. Now with the 4-piece set, we'll have our cryo damage increased by 15%, but on top of that, when a character attacks an opponent affected by cryo, their crit rate is increased by a further 20%. If the opponent is completely frozen, then that increase to our crit rate is even higher, as it will be increased to 40%. So this is one of the main reasons why we need a Hydro character in the team, as we'll be able to completely freeze opponents, giving us that massive crit rate increase. Now, when it comes to the stats on these, when it comes to your Sands, I'd recommend going for the attack percentage. When it comes to your Goblet, I'd recommend going for cryo damage. And then finally, when it comes to your Circlet, I'd recommend mainly going for crit damage, although you could also go for attack percentage or crit rate if you wanted to as well. As for the substats, again focus on crit damage and crit rate, then attack percentage. When it comes to the talents, personally with this build I would say you need a little bit of a balance, focusing evenly on all of them, although I will say that if you're using Kaeya as the main DPS for a Permafrost build, then you may want to work on ceremonial blade work a little bit more than the others. But this build is all about having the right team. There are two caveats for this build to work. Firstly, you need to have a Hydro user in your team, so someone like Barbara, Shincho, Mona, they would all work wonders. But on top of that, you also need to have Chongyun in your team as well. Chongyun is a unique cryo character whose elemental ability infuses his allies with cryo damage as well, which will allow all of Kaeya's attacks to become cryo. So this combined with Hydro means that we'll be freezing opponents all the time, which grants us that massive increase to our critical chance as well. On top of that, because Chongyun is also a cryo character, we'll also have the elemental resonance active on the team that uses this Kaeya build, granting us even more critical rate. The only downside to this build is if an opponent is completely immune to being frozen, as you'll then receive reduced critical rates. And if that is the case, you may want to switch up your artifacts slightly or use one of the other builds featured in this video. Which brings us on to the third and final build, which is the physical main DPS Kaeya build. This build is all about utilising Kaeya as a main DPS. So when it comes to the weaponry for this build, I firstly recommend taking the easy to craft prototype Rancor. This gives us a physical damage bonus increase, as well as a buff that when we hit an opponent, it will increase our attack and defense multiple times. Alternatively, you can use the Black Sword if you're able to get hold of it, or failing that, Harbinger of Dawn again is another decent freestyle option so long as you can keep your health above 90%. Now when it comes to the Kaeya physical DPS build, there are a lot of options when it comes to the artifacts. There are 3 options available to you, but for the purpose of this video, I will be showing off the 4-piece Gladiator set. This uses 4 pieces of the Gladiator set, which gives us a attack percentage increase of 18%, and on top of that, for wearing 4 pieces of the set, we'll have our normal sword attacks damage increased by 35%. Now there are other options. For example, you can use 4 pieces of the Pale Flame set, which will give us increased physical damage, as well as an attack increase buff, which can be very strong so long as you get the attack buff stacks quickly, as well as refresh them before they drop off. Or alternatively, you can use the Bloodstained Chivalry set, which again gives us a physical damage increase for wearing 2 pieces of the set, and on top of that, the 4 piece gives us a buff that after defeating an opponent, it will increase our charge damage attack by 50% and reduce its stamina cost to 0 for 10 seconds. Now in all honesty, all 3 of these sets are good. The main reason I'm showing off the Gladiator set here is because there are very little caveats behind it. The Pale Flame requires you to keep that buff active by using your elemental skill as much as possible, and the Bloodstain 4-set piece requires you to defeat an opponent first in order to activate the buff it gives you. You can, if you wanted to, use 2 pieces of the Pale Flame set combined with 2 pieces of the Bloodstain set, but this could potentially lead to diminishing returns, especially if we're using a physical damage goblet as well as the prototype Rancor, as we are with this build here. But regardless of what you go with in terms of artifacts, on your sands you'll want to go for attack percentage, on your goblet you'll want to go for physical damage increase, failing that you can also go for attack increase, and then finally on your circlet you'll want to go for crit rate, crit damage or attack percentage. As for the substats, again crit rate and crit damage is king, followed by attack percentage. When it comes to your talents, as we are physical main DPS, you'll want to work on ceremony or blade work first, then followed by the other 2. I'd recommend Glacial Waltz as a second choice, followed by Frost Gnaw as your last option. One of the reasons that the physical DPS Kaeya build works well is because he is a cryo character. Cryo combined with electro characters create superconduct elemental reactions, which lowers the physical defense of opponents who are affected by it. So long as you have an electro character that can be combined with this Kaeya build, it's going to allow the cavalry captain to hit very hard. Lastly, before we move on to the pros and cons, if you're still going through the game, I would highly recommend the Exile set for Kaeya, which gives us increased energy recharge and allows our elemental burst to regenerate energy for the entire party. But every character in Genshin Impact has pros and cons. When it comes to Kaeya, his biggest pro is that his elemental burst, his ultimate, persists on the field regardless of if he's the active character or not. This means, as I mentioned, you can switch him out to other characters whilst the battle continues, and he's still able to contribute from the safety of the sidelines. On top of that, his next pro is that his abilities, both his elemental burst and elemental skill, have quite quick cooldowns, meaning that he's great when it comes to switch teams, meaning that he can quickly take the field and perform his abilities. And then finally, for the pros, is that Kaeya is a jack of all trades. As I mentioned with the aforementioned builds in this video, he can take on multiple roles, whether it's a DPSer, sub-DPS, or even support in some respects. He can do it all, but unfortunately there are cons to every character. One of the biggest cons for Kaeya is that unfortunately some of his abilities are limited when it comes to range. His Frost Gnaw only hits opponents straight in front of him, and his Glacial Waltz, the Icicores hug whatever character is active quite closely, which minimises AoE potential. And then finally for the cons is, unfortunately, Kaeya really does rely on having a good team to back him up, especially with certain builds. The physical DPS build requires him to have an electro character in the team that can help activate the superconduct. The Permafreeze build definitely requires both Chongyun and a Hydro character to make work as well, which is overall, in my opinion, a little bit of a con. But regardless, Kaeya has a lot more pros than he does cons, and overall he's a great character. Normally I would go into a bit more detail here talking about the teams, but we've kind of already talked about them. The sub DPS build can pretty much work with any team. The Permafreeze build requires both Chongyun to be in the team as well as a Hydro character. And finally, the physical DPS build requires at least an electro character in the team so you can activate superconduct so the enemy gets decreased physical resistances. But overall, Kaeya is probably one of the best free-to-play characters out there. He can be built in multiple ways and take on multiple roles, which in my books makes him very useful. So there we have it, that is my character guide and overview to Kaeya in Genshin Impact. Now remember that there are multiple ways to play and use characters in the game, which is one of the many aspects that makes Genshin Impact so enjoyable. So at the end of the day, use the character how you want to use them. These builds are how I personally like to use them, and I just hope they help you out in your adventures. So until next time, I've been Darcblade, bringing you a character guide to Kaeya in Genshin Impact. Hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching, subscribe and like for more.